A quilt is 3 layers, a top, a batting, and a bottom layer, and it's attached with threads. So that's the official definition of a quilt. I started with traditional quilts. I really enjoyed putting these fabrics together. And it wasn't too long before I started to want to develop my own designs. And I didn't really want to do the traditional patterns. And I know a lot of quilters do patterns, take those traditional patterns and enlarge them in their mind and work them into something else. And it's just a beautiful thing how even the traditional patterns have become art quilts. There's so many different styles of art quilting nowadays.
We try not to call them quilts, although we seem to always default to fiber art quilts or mixed media textiles, only because quilts have this connotation of the thing that you put on the bed. And if you tell people you're going to a quilt show, that's what they're expecting to see. So you have to try to, it's not mincing words. They can understand it once they see it. It's just that you don't want to put them off before they even see it. You want them to be open to the idea that fiber art is art.
I come to art from actually a traditional quilting background. So I knew how to sew, and back in the bicentennial when quilting had a resurgence and people started to put quilts on the walls, wall quilts, then I decided I would take that up. And eventually got tired of following other people's patterns and very specific designs and began to experiment and do my own thing. And so as I learned more about art, I applied that to what I was doing with fabric and ended up with what we often call art quilts. My process actually borrows pretty heavily from those traditional quilt making techniques. So I am using fabric. I mean, sometimes I get adventurous, but this one is using fabric, and it is pieced together, right sides together the way you would for a dress or for another type of pieced quilt. It does have batting in it, that fluffy layer that gives it the texture, and then it's all stitched all over, which that's what we call quilting. That's where it gets its name, which adds structural strength to it and also texture. So from a technique point of view, it's very similar to traditional quilting. But from an aesthetic point of view, of course, it's very different because there was no pattern that I started with. This all came from my head. Again, very trial and error, working on composition and all the things that any artist would think about.
I think that I'm just always drawn to nature. And when I look at my body of work, there's a lot of blues and greens. I kind of keep going back to that. It's where I'm most comfortable. And I do love being outside in the outdoors. So I think it's just natural for me to do a little bit of both. The fabric backgrounds are all labor intensive, and you make all those and then you have the fabric. Then it's a question of where does it go from there? And it's when you put that second layer on there, that's when you realize where it's going. It's not planned. I mean, for the most part, it's not planned. It kind of evolves.
Most of my representational pieces are of the portrait variety, and I really enjoy people. I like watching people. I think they're so interesting, and their facial features, the lights and the darks. After doing portrait quilts for quite a while, I get into doing these improvisational pieces, and it kind of, what do you say? It works itself. It runs the show. I'm just somebody who's sewing up the seams.
When I'm dyeing fabric, it gives me the opportunity to play with some large-scale designs that you wouldn't necessarily find something like this in a quilting store. And if you did, it would be repeated very rhythmically, whereas on my fabrics, I might actually change design, mid fabric. I like having a diverse neighborhood, having different things going on in the same piece of fabric. I can cut from a particular spot, or I can, again, enjoy the fact that I've got some diversity going on there. And that's the appeal of dyeing your own fabric, is that you're not going to get something repetitious that everybody has.
I start my process with white fabric. It's just a plain white cotton fabric. And I will tear that into manageable size pieces. I take that fabric into the garage where I have what I call a wet studio. It's just a corner of the garage, but wet studio sounds much nicer. And then I work at dyeing the pieces. I dye the fabric. And I use Procyon fiber reactive dyes. I twist and I mutilate and I disturb the fabric in any way I possibly can. I also use cyanotype, which is just way fun because you can cyanotype over fabric that has already been dyed. I like to use botanicals. So sometimes the botanicals make their way into the work because that's just an easy way to introduce them in the cyanotype process. Once the fabrics are all created, I further cut them up and piece together what I think will work.
Sometimes I'm wondering where am I going to start? So I'll just start sewing these little pieces together and then make them a little larger and a little larger. And then I get to a place where it's a quartile of the quilt. Like I'll separate it into four sections and I'll work on that 1/4. This is a fourth of a quilt. So it'll be kind of a large quilt. And that's kind of you just go with it. I often love to listen to improvisational drums or flute or guitar, and I never really thought about quilting as being similar. You just kind of flow with it. It's a beautiful thing when it, even if you make mistakes, and that's the thing, you can't be afraid to make mistakes with this any kind of artwork. You just have to put the paint down, you have to put the material down and go with the flow. And if you don't like it, you cut it out.
This is like a giant flannel board, bulletin board. It's insulation housing with flannel on it. So I can put my pieces up here and pin through it like a giant bulletin board and move things around and do a lot of trial and error to come up with my compositions. I usually have a fabric that I'm starting with that I'm kind of in love with. So on this one, it was this fabric right here. It's all one fabric that has the white and the pink and the black and the yellow polka dots. And so that was my starting point. And then I began to pull out fabrics that, maybe are going to go with it, or maybe they're not. Maybe the color goes with it, but can I use those big dots there without it taking away from my favorite fabric? Same for something like this. And so maybe anything that I think is close, I'll start pinning up on the design wall. And then later I'll begin to subtract things. This fabric was one of my favorites. I loved what was happening. I had it right in here somewhere or something, and then I had the diagonals kind of opposing each other, not running into each other, but going at different angles. And it was very interesting, but it was sort of taking over. So because I was in love with this and wanted to respect this, I decided I'm not going to use this fabric. This might be a great start for that next one when I want that fabric that I'm in love with. So this fabric, as great as it was and as well as it might go, it was becoming the star, which I didn't want in this particular case.
You just don't know sometimes where it's going or where it's coming from, but all of a sudden it's like reveals itself and it just makes sense. I have a lot of quilts that have song titles or that are influenced by songs. I love all kinds of music, but I find that's a recurring thing for me. That was made during COVID. And up in the top left corner, you'll see some spiky coronavirus kind of things. So it's also influenced by what is going on in the news. It's not just music. It's kind of like, okay, what makes the fabric? What is speaking to me at that time? So yeah, it's strange how sometimes your subconscious shows up in works.
I call it thoughtful improvisation because you have to balance all of these pieces with each other. They have to talk to each other. They have to really sing in order to be a piece that's attractive and something that people want to look at.
I'm very attracted to contrast. So living in Florida, we have the strong sunlight and then the strong shadows. And so I think that definitely influences my aesthetic of my preferences. I like a lot of strong colors like we have in our vegetation. And then I like the strong contrast of values. Also, my personality is a little bit of a risk taker. I'm confident. And so my former career was as a flight instructor. And so, not everybody is confident enough to say, yeah, I'm going to learn how to fly, but apparently I have enough ego for these types of things. And that carries through in my art, that I am willing to try something new or to cut into a piece of favorite fabric, whatever the case may be, that I embrace detours and enjoy that whole process of what if and trying the thing that I think is maybe a little bit risky, try the unexpected.
I found out that my great grandfather was a dyer of fabric. This is, as a matter of fact, the street that he lived on is named after him now, on the little village that I come from, on the little island in northern Germany. But to me, it's kind of like, okay, so there's this connection to dye. My mom was a seamstress, so there's a connection to fabric. I dabbled with needlepoint stuff. I dabbled with stained glass. I've done a little bit of clay work, and dolls too. But it's one of these things where, like, no, this is the one that speaks to me, and I like the fact that I can manipulate it. I can control all aspects of it, and get a result that I'm pleased with.
I've always heard, that you paint for yourself, you do your work for yourself. And I truly feel like that's where I'm at.
I'm not a storyteller. I really admire the people who have a story to tell and a message in their art, because mine is just all about, check out this color, check out this contrast. Mine is just all visual about, wow, this is exciting me. Do you see what I see?